All right, joining me now is former FBI Assistant Director Chris Swecker and former FBI Special Agent Nicole Parker. Thank you both for being with us. Chris, let's talk about what we heard there from the current director is about the Discord chat rooms where Robinson frequented, and the numbers apparently are more than 20 individuals who were in that Discord chat room. But there's a lot of other stuff right now out there that people are wondering about. There are suggestions on social media that some were posting ahead of time, that they might know what was going to happen. There are some people in the crowd that acted suspiciously. What right now do you suspect is being investigated to ensure this isn't a bigger enterprise, the assassination of Charlie Kirk?
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, they're going to look into not just Discord, but any other chat room or any other social media website that may have posted about this, that he may have participated in, because that's the relevant factor here, is he would have had to have some level of interaction with others in that chat room or in that social media site. And the only way you're going to charge somebody is if they had pre-knowledge of what was going on or what he intended to do, or maybe even if they inspired him or tried to persuade him to take that type of action. You know, that's where we are with social media these days. I'm afraid that there's a certain level of indoctrination that takes place, much like the old jihadists after 9/11, when we sort of morphed into the lone wolf attacks that were inspired or were the result of indoctrination by Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. This is where we are today.
And I'll go to you on this, Nicole. If, in fact, as Chris suggested, in the investigation, you could find other people in chat rooms or on social media that had knowledge ahead of time and may have even contributed in the form of at least inspiration, encouraged him on, what could be done with those individuals? What kind of charges?
Well, again, this is going to come down to the prosecutor, and what I can reassure you is that after listening to the press conference today, they do have the most aggressive prosecutors on this, on the local level and on the federal level. So again, piggybacking on with what Chris said, aiding, abetting prior to the crime, evasion, trying to prevent evading after the crime. And we saw very clearly that the DA talked about if the roommate is called by law enforcement, the shooter told the roommate, do not cooperate with law enforcement and delete these messages. Mm-hmm. And one thing I'd like to know, it's not just limited to Discord and social media accounts. It's also listed, includes his personal text messages on his cell phone. It could be anybody that he was communicating with. And post-offense, another thing that I would be very curious about, in addition to the messages, are the jail calls. We all know that there's no expectation of privacy once you're booked into the system. I would be interested in knowing who is he calling, what is he saying, and our prosecutors looking. I know that they will look into that as well.
So really quickly, I want to get both of your reaction to this. There are reports out that George Zinn, now anyone that followed the situation on the day of Kirk's assassination knows that the first man sort of taken into custody that day was an older gentleman named George Zinn. He ultimately has no charges pending against him, including obstruction of justice. But there are reports that he did that. He made a scene to draw attention away from the shooter. Now, that could or could not be something that he decided ahead of time or in the moment to do. And we'll also have to confirm the veracity of those reports as to what exactly was going on there. But it is true. First, Nicole, really quickly, then Chris, that did draw law enforcement attention away initially from the shooter.
You're exactly right. That is exactly what happened. When they should have been looking into other individuals, we know that the shooter was actually not even far from the campus and was waiting for law enforcement to leave the area so they could retrieve the weapon. And that is a serious problem. Why would someone claim to be a participant in a major crime if they weren't? That's something that they will definitely be looking into.
It's incredibly odd. Chris?
Yeah, big question is whether that was pre-planned.
But even if it wasn't, Chris,
opportunist and he decided to do that.
Even if it wasn't, that seems like obstruction.
Yeah, even if it wasn't, it could. I was going to say he could have been an opportunist and decided to take the opportunity to disrupt the investigation, to disrupt the response to the shooting, to slow it down. He could have been just in the wrong, in my opinion, the wrong place at the wrong time, and just took the opportunity to do what he did.
All right. Well, again, and to reemphasize, we'll confirm the veracity of these reports. We're going to find out exactly what went down there. There is no doubt that law enforcement focused its initial moments on George Zinn. Why and how that ended up occurring, I think is very worthy of question and investigation. Chris, Nicole, thank you both so much for your time.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.